Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to our inaugural Free Speech Week at UC Merced. We are so excited that you're with us today, especially to help us kick this off. My name is Dania Matos. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Associate Chancellor and Chief Diversity Officer here at UC Merced. We want to start our event and this event, grounding our work in our UC Merced Landing Labor Acknowledgement. You'll see the slide, but I will start sharing a little bit of our land acknowledgement reflection. Local Indigenous people, including the Yokuts and Miwok, who understand the earth as a place for everyone, first inhabited the land where UC Merced is located. When we address diversity on this campus, we do so boldly, daring to look forward and backward, imagining diversity's demand for the 21st century, and the importance of diversity in addressing past wrongs, reaffirming humanity, and ensuring a reconciliatory path of redress for the future. The most prominent path for our campus is called Scholars Lane. By day, you can see, hear, and witness the embodiment of our diversity through campus community members making their way across campus, framed by the slopes and the peaks of the Sierra Nevada. I know we can't be together in person, but we wanted to share a little bit of the land and labor acknowledgement reflection. So as you go through this event, think about what intentions do you have to disrupt and dismantle colonialism beyond this land acknowledgement? What is your organization, unit, department doing beyond acknowledging those whose land and labor allow you to live, work, and or learn in that space? You can find our diversity statement on our website, as well as we have it translated in multiple languages to make it accessible for many members of our community. We started planning Free Speech Week about, over a year ago. And as many things in COVID-19, it took pause. Never did we imagine that it would be so timely. We've experienced the events of anti-Black violence, anti-Semitism, the insurrection on our campus, our nation's capital, as well as the violence that we know our Asian community is currently experiencing. So now more than ever, we recognize that words matter. And I'm so excited to be able to bring this week to you, thanks to the UC Center for Free Speech, National and Civic Engagement. This session is being recorded, as we shared. I'll also turn it over now to Onar Primitivo, who is the Director of Equity and Justice in our office, who's going to walk through community guidelines with you. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and we hope you join us for the rest of the events throughout the week. Oh no, you're on mute.
Thank you. There's so many windows. Thank you, Dania. And again, my name is Onar Primitivo. My pronouns are he, him, his. I serve as the Executive Director of Equity and Justice, as Dania mentioned. And again, thank you for coming and welcome you to our first inaugural Free Speech Week. And as you have registered and joined us today, that you are agreeing to our community agreements, as we know that this will be an opportunity for conversation and for community. So we have 8 agreements, and it starts with: we agree to speak for ourselves and allow others to speak for themselves with no pressure to represent or explain to the whole group that you're owning your narrative and that is your experience. We agree to listen with resilience and hanging in when something is hard to hear, grappling with multiple perspectives and striving for intellectual humility. We agree to consider asking questions to check out the assumption we are making rather than taking that assumption as fact. We agree to share airtime and participate within the suggested timeframe, that when it comes to these conversations, we can go on and on. But again, this is just a springboard for the dialogue. We agree not to interrupt except to indicate that we did not hear the speaker and our guests. We agree to pass or not pass for now if we are not ready or willing to respond to a question. So at times we will be providing you with a prompt, an opportunity to engage. We agree that when we discuss our experience with people who are not present, we will not attach names or other identifying information unless we have permission to do so. So having the consent, and also that what we are in the process of learning, which brings us to the last one, that this is a space of learning and that no one, even the presenter, is able to know all things. We are all in the process of learning. So again, these will be continuously be added to the chat as other folks join us, but these are our community agreements. Okay.
I can jump in here to help, Onar. So yes, so we're going to disable the chat during the presentation, but we're going to open up the chat again during the Q&A. And so now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jenny Lamb. Dr. Jenny Lamb is also our UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. Try saying that 3 times really fast. She is our fellow for this year. We are so excited to have her. Dr. Lamb has also been on our planning committee and has really helped us shape. So I thought it only fitting that she would help launch us the week with the important topic of hate speech and free speech, which I love that you didn't include the adversarial verses. So I'm sure you Sorry, I think I muted myself, huh? So I say, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lamb with a round of applause or your reaction buttons applause.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to get this to launch the PowerPoint. There we go. So my name is Jenny Lamb. Only professionally do I go by Dr. Jennifer. Otherwise, that was what my mom called me when she was mad at me. So Jenny is the best. And as Tanya said, I am the 2021 or one of the 2021 fellows of the University of California's Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. And I am delighted to be here today to kick off the inaugural Free Speech Week at UC Merced. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, before we get started, what is hate speech? And I am actually working on a book about this. And so I'm gonna show you what the traditional definition is. And then I'm gonna show you the definition that I'm proposing through my book. So the traditional definition is expression that attacks individuals or groups because of their race, ethnic background, religion, gender, or sexual preference. Sometimes the specific groups that are incorporated in that are changed, but that's the sort of general traditional definition. So what are we talking about? We're talking about sort of the prototypical, Nazi presentations or KKK presentations. We're talking about people like the charming Westboro Baptist Church, charming is sarcasm, who go around to funerals and protest, and they in particular protest military funerals. And they say that the reason that, there have been, that soldiers are dying is because the United States permits lesbian and gay people to marry and to basically to live in our culture. And then we've got things like this lovely thing on Facebook that says 1/3 of women are physically abused, 2/3 of men aren't doing their job. And this actually was reported and Facebook declined to take that down. So this is sort of the traditional definition of what hate speech is. And I want to give you a sense of, because how does that play out when Facebook is trying to make decisions about what gets taken down and what doesn't get taken down? And I'm picking on Facebook because one of their documents, one of their training documents about what to do about hate speech was leaked in 2017, and ProPublica published it. And so I've got some specific examples from their training document that I'd like to share with you. But again, you'll see it's that general idea that it has to be an attack. And they further specify that it has to be a degrading generalization or a slur. And then that it's targeting a protected category of people, and they list a different set of who counts as protected. So looking at this definition, I want you to think about whether or not these statements meet Facebook's criteria for hate speech. So we're going to launch a poll, and I want you to just say yes or no, whether you think this would classify as hate speech according to Facebook's definition. Do we have a fixed amount of time that this is going to go, or?
I think you tell us when to end it, Dr. Lamb. Should we end?
I think we can go ahead and end it. It looks like the 63% think that it does not meet the criteria. And then maybe you could take down the polling just for a minute so that I can show, or, you know, X out of the poll results. I think I can do it. Okay, there we go. So most of you said no, but actually this was considered to be hate speech under Facebook's training module because it was a degrading generalization and it was targeting a specific nationality. So let's go to the next one. What about this statement? So you can launch the poll again. So I'll give you another couple seconds and then I'll stop the polling. So it looks like we were pretty evenly split there. About 52% think that it's not, about 48% think that it is. Facebook argues, that it is not. And their rationale here is that calls for segregation are unacceptable, but social class is not one of the things that is a protected category. So even though race or ethnicity is, the fact that the poor was amended to it meant that it didn't meet one of the target criteria. And so they did not consider this hate speech. So let's go to the next one. What about this? So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. It looks like about a little more than half thought that this was hate speech, that it met Facebook's criteria for hate speech. And you are right. Because they argue that it includes two protective categories because both race and sex are considered to be categories, protected categories, and that swearing is considered to be an attack. So last one that we'll do. What about this statement? Do you think that this would meet Facebook's criteria for hate speech? So I'm going to go ahead and stop the poll. 3/4 of you thought that this would meet the criteria for hate speech, but according to Facebook, it does not. Because although it's a dismissive attack, they consider immigrants to only be quasi-protected. So this could be considered hate speech. So I think the reason that I wanted to share these examples is because I think it demonstrates how difficult it is to get a good definition of hate speech and then to actually operationalize what that will look like in reality as you try to apply this to particular kinds of speech. So I am proposing in my book a different way of defining hate speech. That is, I'm using a threshold condition. So whether something is hate speech or not is expression in which the communicator suggests that members of a perceived outgroup, so somebody in a group different than theirs, have loathsome characteristics that separate them from the communicator's perceived in-group. So basically there's this intergroup dynamic that plays a role in defining whether or not something is hate speech. And part of the reason that I'm proposing this is I don't think it's useful to identify specific groups, because you've got problems like if Facebook's coming up with these definitions in the United States, what are they doing when they look at things in other countries? So they need to have people from those countries who can tell them about who the sort of, minority groups or the ones that are the targets of hate speech more often. Also, there's certain like occupations right now that are being targeted, such as scientists and journalists for the last 4 years have been really under attack. But this is not enough to sort of think about what to do about hate speech. And so in addition to this threshold condition, I suggest that you have to consider some additional analyses in order to really have an understanding of what we should do about hate speech. And one of those things is the vulnerability of the person who's being targeted by the hate speech. So there can be economic vulnerability, there can be political vulnerability, there can be actual physical safety concerns. And so that is something that needs to be considered along with the power dynamic between the communicator and the target. And this is talking about these differentials can be based on somebody having formal power and the other person not. So for example, when a politician attacks somebody who is, just an average person or a journalist or something like that, there's a power differential when somebody who has official state power behind them does these things. A prior individual relationship between the two people. And so, for example, you might, a boss and an employee or something like that could also count. But then also on a less sort of individual level, you need to also look at the historical and contemporary intergroup relations. So if you're looking at, in the United States, people who are minorities in minority groups, those folks tend to have less power than white men. So for example, under my definition, the statement white men are assholes, I don't feel like there's as much need to answer that because of the power differential. The person saying it likely has less power, historically at least, than the person being targeted or the group being targeted. So that's those two things are important. Another sort of aspect of this is looking at the severity and the imminence of the potential effects. So what might happen as a result? Is there actual physical harm that might happen? Is it psychological harm? Is it fear for your safety? And then how likely are these effects to happen quickly? So those are both things that need to be considered. Obviously, the content of the expression, if there's a threat, that's already something that we can deal with actually on a legal basis. But looking at the specific words that are used is an important aspect of this as well. And then the size and composition of the audience. So how big, how much is this spread? And also, who are the people receiving this? Are these people that are within the communicators in group? Are these people who are in the targets in group? Who is it that's made up of this? And then also the context of the expression. So when the events of January 6th were mentioned, the insurrection at the Capitol, if you think about the speeches that were made before that, you think about the liberal and the Republican legislators that were sort of supporting going ahead and certifying the election results were sort of the target from people at the sort of pro-Trump rally. And then this possible severity of what they were asking them to do, as well as the imminence of it, would make this something that you would want to respond to very quickly. But if you think about something like, on the news, there's research has shown that there's always a prominence, sort of outsized with reality, that Black men are represented as criminals more often than the percentage in reality, right? So that's less, that might have severe effects, but the imminence of it is less. And so the response might be different, not less, might be different. So this is sort of my thinking in terms of making this more complicated and more sort of reflective of all the different aspects of hate speech that you need to consider. So why are we defining hate speech? And I think the answer to that generally is that we want to identify that which should be responded to in some manner. We don't want to just let it go. And in particular, we think that this expression has real or perceived consequences that conflict with other things that we think are important. And so in terms of hate speech, it is sort of freedom of expression, which is a valued right in the US especially, is balanced with the equality and dignity of individuals and groups in our society. So those are that's sort of the balance that's happening. And yes, Dania, I on purpose did not put verses because I think these things intersect. I don't think they're just in, can't even think of the right word right now, but they're not just meeting each other, they intersect in various ways. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind. The other thing I want to point out is that we often, when we're talking about responses to hate speech, we're often focused on what we should do about the communicator. How should we punish them, or how should we ban their speech, or whatever. But we don't also talk about enough, I think, what can we do to support the targets of hate speech, to make them feel safe and to alleviate the harm that hate speech has caused to them? And then also, what can we do on the societal level? Because as you see these things over and over, it begins to normalize some of these attitudes. And so it's important to not only address the people involved, but also the society in which these things are happening. And so all three of these things need to be done in order to really respond effectively to hate speech. So there are a couple of different ways I'm going to talk about, general ways that you can respond to hate speech. But I want to sort of set the stage in terms of the United States, and that we are unique among Western democracies in how we handle hate speech legally. We have very much a tradition where rather than censoring hate speech, we have a preferred sort of approach of encouraging more speech to answer problematic speech. The exception to that, as I mentioned before, is that for true immediate threats, then that can be dealt with under the US legal framework pretty well. The other thing I want to mention is that Congress passed Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is, you may have heard about this a bit lately. It allows for internet service providers and platforms or apps to do some content moderation without becoming legally responsible for the expression that they might miss. So initially, when we started sort of a long time ago with the internet, they were saying that anybody who was an internet service provider or platform could not moderate content. And if they started moderating content, then they were going to be legally responsible for any content that was published on their site. But now they passed this, that they do allow content moderation without sort of making the internet service provider or the platform legally responsible. So there's a lot of debate about this right now in terms of, banning, for example, banning Trump from Twitter. Should Section 230, should internet service providers have that power? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The other thing I want to mention is that traditionally in the United States, political speech is given the highest levels of protection for the First Amendment, and even false political speech has been given protection. And so the sort of systemic and systematic use of disinformation has been very challenging to this sort of tradition that we have. So that's the framework in which we operate. And so one of the ways that you can limit the effects of hate speech is to have some kind of government regulation. And the First Amendment, however, through court cases, the First Amendment bars most content-based regulation, which is what regulation of hate speech would be, by any part of the government. And so this is talking about not only the federal government, but state and local government. This is talking about police. This is talking about public universities. And so if you are at a public university, there is a First Amendment reason why the public university may not be able to do what you would want them to do in response to hate speech, because they are not allowed to do it based on the court rulings that have come out about First Amendment and hate speech. So another approach, because legislators know that it's unlikely that anything will come of that any law that they might pass like this would probably be struck down by the courts. Oftentimes they'll take the approach that I've heard referred to as government by raised eyebrow. And what that means is that the government will express interest in something. For example, making Mark Zuckerberg come and testify before Congress and ask him questions about the way that they do business, and maybe suggest that they're very concerned about this. And if something doesn't happen, they may have to act. And so they use this sort of, raised eyebrow to encourage industry self-regulation, which, can be more or less successful. So industry self-regulation just means that the industry is taking its own approach to being able to see how to deal with hate speech online on their platforms usually. Now, there's a lot of issues with industry self-regulation One of them is logistical issues. And that is, there is just so much content. You think about how much content is posted even like on YouTube or on Facebook or Twitter, just in a day. And it's a huge amount of content. And so just logistically, that can be very tricky to deal with. And so also this question of what definitions and standards to use comes up. As we saw with the examples, you guys did not always agree, and I don't always agree with the kinds of standards that they use. And in fact, there's very little transparency about what definitions and standards that they use by these platforms. The other sort of piece of this is that there's the internet is truly global, and traditionally laws about these kinds of things or industry self-regulation have been nation bound, but that's not possible anymore. And so this sort of approach to hate speech that many of the US based platforms that are international take are looked upon very badly by countries that have taken a different approach. So with this content, this massive amount of content, technical solutions are really the only way that they've been able to get any kind of handle on this. But technical solutions can be problematic. So for example, if you block, basically it's keyword blocking. And so if you block the term breast from it, you might also block, in addition to any kind of sexual reference about that, you might also block chicken breast recipes. You might also block breast cancer information. So they're very blunt tools. They're not very precise. And the other thing is that they can be worked around. So there were white supremacist groups that when some of the sites started cracking down on them, they started using different words instead of the words that were, so they were using words like Skittles or Google to mean other things. And so they were able to get around those sort of technical solutions that way. There are some cases where they do have human moderation. And the piece that I wanted to mention about that is that most of this is contracted out. And so these are not people actually hired by the platforms. And they are asked to do so many judgments in a single day. And they are seeing the worst of humanity on a regular basis. And the psychological toll that this takes is massive. And so this sort of question of how to get a human sort of eye on these sorts of things is more complicated than you might think as well. And again, there's a lack of transparency about what the process is. And there's a lack of due process, so that if something is taken down, there's no clear way that you go about contesting that. So for example, when they were cracking down, I think it was Facebook that was cracking down on white supremacist, or actually it was YouTube, it was cracking down on white supremacist videos. They also ended up taking down things that were educational videos about World War II. And it's not clear how you go about sort of saying, but wait, this was educational, this is not hate speech. And then also the industry, the way that their business model is set up, encourages that which is controversial, because their ultimate desire is for you to be engaged, for you to stay on their platform. And the thing that makes people engaged is strong emotions. And so if you click on something that is controversial, you're going to see more things like that. And probably you're going to see more extreme things like that. And so this sort of business model is contradictory to what they might be trying to do in terms of content moderation. And so how does it actually play out? And again, because of the lack of transparency, oftentimes we don't know. Another way of limiting the effects of hate speech are advocacy and education campaigns. There are three basic types of these. One is to raise awareness about discrimination and hate speech in general. So for example, the Anti-Defamation League keeps a hate symbol database, and they track what's going on. They let people know about this so that others can understand the symbols that might be out there. There are also affirmative campaigns that present targeted groups in a positive way. As Danya mentioned, there has been a tremendous amount of anti-Asian xenophobia with COVID. So there's a campaign out there now that has that features people who are Asian American, and the tagline is "Fight the virus, fight the virus, fight the bias." And so that's an affirmative campaign to show these groups in a positive way. And then there are obstructive campaigns that try to collect information and try to take steps to restrict or obstruct the activity of hate groups in particular. And an example of that is the Southern Poverty Law Center has a number of other programs that they do around hate and extremism, and particularly around white supremacist groups or nationalist groups. And then the last sort of way of limiting the effects of hate speech are these micro level efforts to address specific situations. So this Rethink app was created by a young woman who was actually in high school, and she was noticing that there was a lot of bullying going on among kids in the middle school and high school. And so she created this app that is put onto your devices, and then when you are sending out a tweet, a text, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, if it has certain words in it, it will come up with a little box that says, "Are you sure you want to send this?" And they've done studies, and some 90% of people think twice and don't send it. And so she created this. She's actually now a college student, but this is one sort of specific thing that she wanted to address, and she came up with this app and has been very successful implementing it. There are also people who consider themselves to be cyber vigilantes, who look for people who are doing or posting racist things. They track down their identities and they contact somebody in their life. There was one example of a woman who had been sort of trolled by a bunch of gamers, and she went down and she figured out who they were, and she actually sent copies of their posts that they had sent her to their mothers, which I kind of loved. But they also, people have done this to employers and such as well. There are also, again, specific event things. So when the Pulse nightclub funerals were happening, the Westboro Baptist Church, the one that I showed you early on that talks about gays and that God doesn't approve and all this stuff, they were coming to protest at these funerals. And a group heard about this and decided to create these angel costumes that are shown in this picture here, so that the mourners, as they passed by in their funeral procession, would not have to see the Westboro Baptist Church. So they didn't actually stop them from protesting, but they blocked the view of them from the street so that the people wouldn't have to view that on this already very difficult day. Another example is there was a town in Germany who apparently some big Nazi, I don't even remember which one, was born there or was buried there or something. There was some connection to it. And every year, I think on his birthday, they would come and they would march in this town, the neo-Nazis. And the town for a while just did, what you would expect, the sort of protest. And sometimes there was violence. And then finally somebody had the idea that rather than do that, they started this campaign where they would, people would raise money for every meter that this group walked. They would donate a certain amount of money. And then the amount of money that was collected at the end was given to a group that got people out of hate groups. And so rather than being sort of confrontational with this group, they started greeting them with signs that said things like, "Thanks for raising money for anti-hate," or, these sort of basically making fun of or trolling the Nazis. And so in the sort of news coverage that I've seen, the participation in these events has gone way down. because they're taking this approach to it and sort of not giving them the conflict that they were looking for, or that they appeared to be looking for. So I want to talk just briefly about the setting of higher education and this question of how we deal with free speech and hate speech in higher education. And I think it's important to remember that campuses can't choose between freedom of expression on the one hand and diversity, equity, and inclusion work on the other. They need to do both. And so we have to find a way to make this balance. The other thing that makes this complicated is that on a campus, there are an ever-changing group of individuals that all have different statuses. That can include students, it can include faculty, it includes staff, administration. It even includes members of surrounding community or anybody who wants to come protest or do anything on campus from the public. So there's a huge, a group, lots of different people that you might need to address in terms of this conflict. Also, there are a wide variety of settings on campus. So most of the discussion that you hear about are the things that happen in public venues. And we shouldn't block controversial speakers from coming and that sort of thing. But there's also classrooms. There are dorms where students are actually living. Social media, there's all these sort of different settings that happen on for campuses as well. So talking about how campuses should respond has to be more complicated than just what should we do in public venues. It has to be across these different settings and across all these different types of people. So just a few takeaways, and then I would love to answer questions. Biggest thing to take away is that balancing hate speech with free speech is complex. This is not a simple issue. There are so many different variables that play a role. Secondly, that a commitment to freedom of expression doesn't have to be incompatible with responding to hate speech in some way. There are ways to do it that are compatible with with free speech, while still addressing the harms, the very real harms that hate speech can cause. On campuses, I recommend that these issues, and particularly the conflict and the balance between these, are talked about on a regular basis and talked about before there is a crisis situation. You have a lot more credibility if these conversations are happening before there's some particular thing that brings us to the fore. One of the things that I find problematic is that oftentimes the only time freedom of expression is talked about with regard to this situation is to tell students who have been harmed in some way that there's nothing the campus can do because of the First Amendment. And so that to me is something that should be avoided. And then finally, I would like to suggest that people need to think creatively about possible responses, that you can use the kind of situation like the group in Germany did, where you can take back some agency so that you're not just doing what the person who's coming expects you to do, and to try to sort of neutralize them in ways that you might not initially think of. So those are sort of the takeaways that I hope you'll get. And I'm very happy to take questions. So just add them to the chat, and then someone will let me know what they are.
Great, thank you, Dr. Jenny Lam. We have opened up the chat. Because for time constraints, we can probably take two. So if you have a question that we can entertain, please do so in the chat button or in the chat box.
I am going to stop sharing the screen.
Okay.
That's all right for everybody.
I think everyone's digesting everything, Dr. Lam. I know personally, sort of, you covered it a little bit, but one of the interesting things is, hate speech is actually not legally codified, right? And so it's been kind of those responses. I think I was surprised by Facebook's standard. So, have they changed since the leak? Have we had another leak? Do we know about? And now that Facebook owns Twitter, Instagram, and, kind of a monopoly, is that applicable across all the boards, or how do you see that changing?
So there has not been another leak that I am aware of. And so we know that the standards have changed, but we don't know what the new standards are. And so, because, for example, of public things that they've announced, like they're trying to crack down on misinformation about the virus, for example, and vaccine misinformation. So we know that there are some additional standards that they've put into place, but and also things around the insurrection that have been taken down as well. But we don't know exactly what they are. There's a group of people that are from different sort of organizations, advocacy organizations, that are that have created this list of demands that they're hoping that will be adopted by platforms. That their campaign is called Change the Terms. And one of the main things that they are arguing for is increased transparency of what the rules are, because the platforms at this point have tremendous power about our, how our speech happens. This is where the public is having conversations. And so it's important for us to know how they're making decisions and what criteria they're using.
Great.
Thank you.
And Jenny, we do have a question, and I think folks in higher education can also chime in. The question is, how do you recommend campuses promote attendance of these events outside of the voluntary ones? And goes on, that it's a great recommendation to encourage these events regularly, but how do we ensure that those that may need it attend? Right?
So there's a couple things that we've done on our campus. We've tried to do this once a semester. And in the fall semester, we usually tie it to the National Free Speech Week, which is an organization that sort of promotes that once a year in late October. And so we're able to sort of get news coverage and stuff from these things, because there's a peg to something that's happening nationally. And then we also, I have been able to work with our Chief Diversity Officer as well. And so we have had a little bit of a budget to be able to do some promotional things. And then in terms of students, quite honestly, we ask professors to give a point or two of extra credit to their students, and many students will do just about anything to get that extra credit. And so a lot of students attend because of those reasons, or some classes require them to attend like a certain number of presentations on campus. And so that can count as one of their presentations that they have to attend.
Great, thank you. And the second question is, what are the implications of corporations like Zoom being so closely involved in the delivery of academic content and events on college campuses?
Yeah, this is a really tricky one because there have been instances where Zoom has actually deplatformed somebody that a university was trying to bring in. They have decided that they wouldn't host it. And so giving Zoom that power to me seems deeply problematic. They have no connection to the university. They don't have that same educational commitment. I mean, in terms of, they don't have that connection in terms of, any kind of payment or how they receive, how they're funded and how they're run. So this seems to me deeply problematic. And I think that universities need to be willing to use other platforms as well, if Zoom is going to do some of these things. But also Zoom, was not anticipating this virus. And so they've had other issues like, Zoom bombing happening and even happening in the chat where like the professor doesn't necessarily notice it. And so there's a lot of sort of, because, virtual classes have become so, virtual classes and virtual events have become so much relied upon. I think that this has really highlighted the challenges of providing this. On the other hand, I also think that, being able to provide these things on Zoom allows people from lots of different parts of the country to attend these things, and that they may not, if it was in person, they may not have been able to attend. I have a colleague who runs a lecture series every fall, and she had people who were coming from other countries that were attending these sessions. And so I think, that's a big benefit as well. So I think there's, a tension, a pull about using these kinds of services.
Great, thank you. And again, being mindful of time, again, we just want to thank you, Dr. Jenny Lam, for kicking us off for our first inaugural Free Speech Week at UC Merced. And before I turn it over to my colleague, just to let you all know that we have a calendar, and we will post the link to in the chat of all the different events this coming week. And another announcement is, if you are an undergraduate scholar joining us today, we do have a raffle, and my colleague Maria will take over. But it's a raffle for a book titled Cass. It's an Oprah book club, Cass, The Origin of Our Discontent. So stay tuned. We will do a raffle, and and I'll turn it over to Maria.
Thank you so much, Onar. And before we announce the giveaway winners for the book, I just wanted to encourage you all to complete our feedback survey. It'll also be sent in an email after the event for everybody who registered, and I just included it in the chat. So now I'll quickly share my screen, and I'll show you the book giveaway names. So everybody who registered for the event was entered into this book giveaway, and we're pleased to announce that we get to select 4 winners for an ebook for the book that my colleague Onar just mentioned. So it's Cass, The Origin of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson, who is a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and it's actually part of Oprah's book club for 2020. So I'm going to hit spin, and you all get to see as we live see the winners, okay?
I feel like Wheel of Fortune.
Yeah.
Where's the music? Cue the music.
Sorry.
I actually don't know the music. What is the music?
I don't either. I did Jeopardy.
No, you can't hear the music. It's probably because my headphones are off.
Of course.
So there was a lot of clapping and cool music. So I'll do that 4 more times. And all of the winners that are selected will be contacted after the event just for some additional details so that we can send you the ebook that you won. And it's at no cost to you. It's a free ebook, and it's really helpful because it focuses on a lot of various caste systems that exist in the US, and then provides some ways through which we can navigate coming together and focusing on things that connect us, as opposed to just focusing on things that divide us, which is really important when we're talking about issues of hate speech and free speech. So we hope that it'll be helpful for all of the winners. And if you don't get selected, so one more time, and then we're done with the winner selection for this event. If you don't win today, don't worry about it. Register for our other events if you haven't done so already. We're gonna select 5 winners for each of our 7 Zoom sessions. So you have plenty of other opportunities to win. So thank you all to those winners. Congratulations. We will contact you and we will ask for some more details so that we can get that book to you. But with that, so yeah, congrats. I see the chat now is popping up. So
I know.
Congrats to everybody that won. Yeah. So again, if you didn't win today, don't be discouraged. Enroll and register for our other Zoom events later on in the week, and you'll have an opportunity to be one of 5 winners every time we have a Zoom session during our inaugural Free Speech Week. And with that, I'll turn it to Dania.
Yeah,
final thoughts.
I'm so glad that you were speaking, because I wanted everyone to join me in another Zoom reaction round of applause to Maria Ramirez Loyola. She is the superstar graduate student researcher who was the point person on Free Speech Week and made this all happen, made it flawlessly, gracefully. We are so grateful to have you. Thank you for doing this. Thank you to the entire team of the Office of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion. You all are phenomenal superstars as well, and I couldn't do this work without you. And thank you to Dr. Lamb. I think you set the bar really, really high, and I think we had a lot to learn of. I'm going to download that Rethink app, and we'll be sure to send you all the resources that Dr. Lamb shared. And once again, thank you to the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. I thought their executive director on, Michelle Deutschman, thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you for helping us just to connect virtually and still be able to continue and grow. And we look forward to seeing you at the rest of the week. Have a wonderful evening.